board of, which is a roadmap for institutions to move in a more sustainable direction. They're competing against themselves to get better every year. And we rolled out all these sorts of actions. So here we are, we did education, and I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people in institutions and public schools and private schools. I got a master's degree. That's more education. And then we did all of these actions. But what became more and more clear is that this isn't enough, right? This isn't enough. And we need something deeper. And actually one funny thing, at one point during those years, I was nicknamed in my synagogue the Greener Rebbitzin, because I would get, you know, in the same way that rabbis get phone calls about, you know, can I do this? Is this kosher? I would get, is this kosher in a green way? And I had a nickname, the Greener Rebbitzin. And this is going on for years and years and years. And for about 7 years, I was doing all this work in an extracurricular fashion, and I was running a tech startup during the day. And we were just marching on. At some point, actually, before I get to the picture here, I want to tell you about a data solution that I was working on in 2008. 2008, shortly after I finished my master's degree, I partnered with 2 NASA climate scientists who worked directly for Jim Hansen at the time at NASA GISS, actually above Tom's Restaurant from Seinfeld fame on 112th and Broadway is a NASA GISS, the Goddard Institute of Space Studies. And I was working with these NASA climate scientists to take data out of the global climate models that are housed there and bring them into industry, to help industry understand how is climate going to be affecting us in the future. But 2008 was 4 years before Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in 2012, and nobody wanted to hear about it. The insurance industries didn't want to incorporate the data into the work they were doing because it would just mean premiums would be higher. Nobody wanted to fund us. In 2008, it was the worst recession of that time. And money was not coming to startups who were working on things like that. So that startup died. But I'd always had my eye on the data and understanding how we can help anybody, how we can help the private sector, the public sector moving forward. So after that startup died, I went back in technology and worked for 7 years running a tech startup and doing all this other kind of stuff in my spare, in my extracurricular time. In 2019, a really important report came out from the IPCC. I'm assuming most of you know the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the international body run by the UN of scientists who have been studying this and reporting to us since the late 1990s on climate. This report was groundbreaking in the sense that it showed us what impact we can make in the long run and what the difference is between stopping global temperatures from rising 2 degrees versus 1 degree, right? We've always been talking about capping climate change at 2 degrees, and I'm talking about Celsius, centigrade, and what the difference would be if we were able to cap it at 1.5. Now, here's the thing. It is true, and it is really painful to say this in the situation that we're in right now, but it is true that each decade from now on will contain more suffering than the prior decade. And what this report shows us is that we have a choice. The choice is in our hands as to how much suffering will be in the world. And the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees are the lives of 150 million people and hundreds of trillions of dollars. So a lot of this information is coming from a book called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, which I highly recommend to everyone. And he puts all of this data together in a very, very dense book. At 1.5 degrees, the world will be $20 trillion richer than at 2 degrees. And the more we turn it up, so if you're thinking just in costs, that's one way to think about it. But if you're thinking about lives and displacement and pain, it's hundreds of millions of lives. So when I heard that in 2019, I started thinking about, it was clear that changing our light bulbs and walking to work and recycling were not going to get us what we need. And I had the opportunity one evening, at the end of the summer, to meet a woman named Margaret Klein Solomon. Margaret Klein Solomon was a psychiatrist who also around 2006 started an organization called the Climate Mobilization. And she is responsible for moving the language from climate change, which had moved into climate crisis, to climate emergency. In fact, last June, the New York City Council passed a resolution to declare a climate emergency. And there are millions of people around the world living in cities, states, and countries that have declared a climate emergency. And she is calling for World War II scale climate mobilization. The website is in front of you. And when I met her, I said to her, I want to ask you the same question that I asked a whole bunch of people, including Bill McKibben and Francis Beinecke and Al Gore many years ago. I said, if you had a foot soldier, because here we are again, 12 years later, talking about World War II scale mobilization, if you had a foot soldier, what front would you put them on? And her immediate answer was politics, policy, and advocacy right away. Education, action, advocacy. We've moved there through time. What it is clear at this point is that we need absolute systemic change. We don't just need people changing their light bulbs. We need full systems of energy to change. So we are lucky enough to live in a state that passed the CLCPA. And I know a lot of people on this call were instrumental in making phone calls and lobbying for that. And how is it that we are going to get something as, I don't want to use the word progressive. It's progressive. It's groundbreaking. It is the most aggressive in the country. It's the most aggressive climate bill in the country, looking at net zero emissions by 2050, 100% renewable energy, 35% of the funding going to frontline communities. How is it that we're going to get that kind of thing, which is a Green New Deal at the local level, implemented? The way we're going to get that implemented is by saying YIMBY. Everybody knows NIMBY, not in my backyard. Oh, don't put this in my backyard and don't put this in my backyard, which is how low-income communities have been discriminated against for years. The way we're going to get the opposite implemented is by saying YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. Yes, please test an electric vehicle station on my street. Yes, please change my power source to something else. Yes, please put in bioswales to collect water and solar panels on our roof and whatever I need to do on my corner at the most local level, please do it. The moment Margaret Klein Solomon said to me, the front we need to be on is politics, is the moment that it solidified for me that I was going to run for office. Now, this conversation is not about that. It's not about politics. I just wanted to share with you the changes that I went through, from the education of just giving presentations to the action of getting people to go to the climate march with many of you. We marched together, and changing institutions through a green seal and getting people to compost and all that. Now we need to make sure that everyone who is in office and who we elect to office is thinking only faster and more aggressively. You can think Green New Deal at the most local level all the time, because that is the new front. The only way we're going to make these changes is on an absolute systemic level. Okay, here are more details going into this. Is from the 1.5 degree, right? So how important is it that we keep down to 1.5? These charts are really hard to read, but if you look at the little, oh, I might be able to, right. If you look at the little 1.5 and the different colors, oh, I get to circle it. I hope you could see that. The difference in color from a yellow to a red to a purple is the effect that this is going to have. So for example, at 1.5 degrees, we might still have some mangroves, but at 2 degrees, they'll be at much higher risk. So that it just shows you ecosystem by ecosystem and people by people, the impacts and the risk at the different temperatures. And then how quickly must we do this? Well, we must do it really quickly, right? We must go from our current emissions scenario drastically down in order to get where we need to go. And that's sort of the last piece of my puzzle, is the year 2030. This report shows us that by 2030, we need to have done all the work systemically that we can do to bring us to where we need to be on climate. The New York City election cycle, we're going to get through the presidential election and we're going to get through the census in 2020. In 2021, all of New York City is turning over. Your mayor, your comptroller, your borough presidents, and 35 out of 51 seats in the city council are turning over. Those seats take office in 22. And they have 2 4-year terms with a term limit ending in 2030. By the time that full administration is done, we have to be at the point where we are at zero. And we can't futz around. If we had done this in 1988, it would have been a much less drastic, much smoother slope down into transition. But here we are, we have no time to waste, and we have no choice. We must change the systems. So when I heard from Margaret Klein Solomon that politics is the only way, policy is the only way forward, and that the year 2030 lines up with this, that's what I decided to do. Last year, and this, it's just been so many horrible events. Last year we had the fires in Australia. When I was thinking about the coronavirus, and with this I'll conclude, and then happy to have comments and questions. When the fires were blazing in Australia, and we were sort of, those of us who were awake to what was going on and the impacts of climate on people, on communities, and on nature, it was devastating. But something really interesting happened, with nature. Photographers went back to the blackened landscape of Australia a few weeks later, and what they started seeing were green shoots. They started seeing green coming out, and many of the same species, and then some new species that couldn't bloom before, but now that the canopies were gone, they were coming back to life. When I think about what's going on now with Corona, and with Main Street and small business and people suffering, I think about this picture. And I think about, after the devastation, we are resilient, people are resilient. What are going to be the green shoots? We are entering a creative renaissance. We have people at home doing really, really interesting things, digging deep, trying to figure out how to sustain themselves and their loved ones and their community. What are these green shoots going to be, and how can we systemically support them? Hopefully by electing people or voicing what matters to the powers that be. But something will sprout. I have no idea how long we will be black. I have no idea how deep the devastation will be. But this is the image that I think about that brings me hope for the future. And with that, I would just like to open it up to any share and thoughts that you may have.